everybody. Thanks so much for coming and grabbing lunch. My name is Sarah Burgard. I'm the director of the Pop Study Center, and I get to be the constant admirer of all of our panel of speakers at this wonderful brown bag. Today, I wanted to introduce our speaker, but first I just wanted to tell you kind of why he's here. So Dr. Brooks is here as part of what we call the APC Fellows Program, the Association of Population Centers. So believe it or not, all the population centers across the country in aging and demography have an association of all the directors of those centers, and we get together and sort of strategize and think about where the direction of population science is going. We were just meeting in Boulder for the last couple of days. So I just got back from a beautiful hike in the mountains on Saturday. And it was a very interesting meeting, as you might expect, for population science right now and people running centers that are grant funded. But we had a lot of great discussions about sort of dealing with the government shutdown right now and the sort of funding situation that we're in. And I just wanted to let you know that we collaborate with each other, and it's just the most amazing community of people. So a couple of years ago, before I was the president of that, I started a program called the APC Fellows Program, where we bring in fellows from other pop centers who are in the first 10 years of their career, and we invite them to our brown bag to have sort of cross collaboration between the centers and to get junior folks a little bit of exposure, connect them up with people they've already met or that they want to meet that do research in their area. And we were really lucky to get Dr. Brooks as our visitor this year. So we're thrilled to have you. And I wanted to introduce Dr. Matt Brooks, who's an associate director at the Florida State Center for Demography and Population Health, as well as being the Charles B. Nam Assistant Professor in the Sociology of Population. Matt helps to run a demography master's degree program at Florida State and participates with lots of other demographers and gerontologists and folks there. His area of expertise, as some of you already know, is in a range of the ways that rural areas in the United States face different socioeconomic issues or similar ones with different modifiers, primarily those that intersect with families, health, and poverty. And he has a couple of great papers recently in rural sociology and in demography. I think the talk is going to touch on some of those findings. And so I'm going to have Matt take it away. We'll hold most questions till the end like normal. And thanks again, people on Zoom and in person.
Hi, everyone. Like Sarah just said, my name is Matt. I'm at Florida State University, but I'm presenting work with my co-author / former postdoc supervisor, Shelley Clark, who's at McGill University. And today I'm going to be talking to you, just like the title says, about the unexpected changes happening in rural families in the United States. So historically, and we know this from both empirical work and also the kind of some of the more grand theories of social change and family change in sociology, is that the differences between family life in rural areas and urban areas is kind of foundational to how we think about social change. And historically, families in rural America were more traditional. And by traditional, I'm kind of just meaning near universal marriage. Almost all kids were born to married parents. And they were much less diverse than urban families. And by diverse, I kind of mean shorthand for less prevalence of cohabitating parents or single moms or kinship care, so kids who were raised by someone other than their married parents. And this was really something that was true for many decades. But starting in around the 1980s, we started to see, or starting in the 1990s, we started to see really this convergence in rural and urban families. Cohabitation increased in rural areas. Single parenthood became more common in rural areas, or really caught up to the rates we're seeing in urban areas. And this is really, the scholars at the time think that this was a product of economic restructuring that was happening in rural areas. Rural areas saw this big economic shift away from manufacturing and agriculture-based jobs that are traditionally considered pretty stable or pretty, good for many working class families, and really shifted towards service-type jobs, or in many rural areas, effectively no jobs. And this sort of, economic disruption led to a lot of changes that happens in families. But even more recently, we've seen rural America continue to be disproportionately impacted by things like the Great Recession. The opioid epidemic is at least within the popular culture, is very much imagined as a big issue in rural America. And then even the COVID-19 pandemic. And all of these changes might have really led to rural family structures continuing to change even more, and maybe even catching up or even outpacing urban families in terms of their types of diversity or their non-marital family structures. And this is true with the paper that Sarah mentioned that came out in Tomography recently. We really do find that rural, and this is looking at women women between 18 and 44. We really do find that marriage rates are on the decline in rural areas. Rural women are much less likely to be married than their urban peers. Cohabitation's on the rise. Singlehood is quickly catching up to what's going on in urban areas. And at the same time, within the most recent cohort that we were able to look at, the majority of rural children were born to non-married parents in urban areas. It's actually been this like skyrocketing thing since the mid-90s. Something that was traditionally very uncommon in rural areas, being born to unmarried parents, is actually the majority of rural births. So we're seeing we are in fact seeing a lot of changes that are happening to the family structures of women and the types of families that kids are born into, but that doesn't necessarily translate to the actual families that kids grow up in, right? Because this isn't, the top half doesn't tell you about what's actually happening to kids, and the bottom half, as we know, oftentimes kids might be born to unmarried parents, but then their parents might quickly marry afterwards. So we might think, for a number of reasons, that the types of families that rural kids live in are changing. Specifically, we now think rural kids are less likely to live in married parents with married parents than urban children. And the reason why maybe we should care beyond that, beyond pure family demography, is that this might put rural kids at a higher risk of poverty than they were in previous decades. And that's because there's just an unfortunate, very strong association between children's family types, broadly speaking, and the risk of poverty and whether or not they grow up in poverty. And this is particularly going to be impactful for rural areas is because rural-urban poverty disparities are historically quite large and historically quite persistent. As you can see on the graph, this comes from some USDA data. It's pretty much since the 1950s, or basically since we've ever been able to capture poverty rates in the United States, is that rural-urban poverty rates, at least under traditional measures, rural poverty rates are higher. And then despite some ups and down fluctuations, they've been about 4, 5, 6% higher in rural areas compared to urban areas. So therefore, we might think that, okay, if there's more kids who are growing up in non-marital families, the poverty rates of rural kids might be increasing, and rural-urban poverty disparities might also be increasing if you kind of just follow the basic logic between family structures and poverty rates. But there's reasons for optimism. If this is the one-for-one sort of thing, then they wouldn't do this paper. So there's reasons why this might not be true. There might not be this one-for-one relationship between family change and increasing poverty disparities. And the first one is that the graph that I just shown, and most research that's looked at child poverty and poverty in America, rural America specifically, has used the official poverty measure, which is produced by the US Census Bureau, and it's been shown to be biased in many ways against rural families and also non-marital families. The OPM, first of all, it doesn't really consider taxes or tax credits or many governmental transfer programs. It also splits up cohabiting families. Under the OPM, if you have a mom and kid and cohabiting partner's income is not considered for the poverty status or for the poverty calculation of the mom and kid. So therefore, you're kind of artificially breaking up families that we know in reality probably do have shared income and shared resources. It also uses a very basic basket of very basic baskets of goods. It's really only looking at like groceries. It's not really considering a wide range of sorts of things. And to counter those critiques, starting in about the mid-2000s, the Census Bureau started producing the supplemental poverty measure, which counters all those critiques. It takes into consideration taxes and tax credits, which will be important later on for the talk, and also deducts basic expenses. It uses that larger definition of family, so it rejoins cohabiting families. So therefore, cohabiting families that have a kid, both of their parents' income is considered for the poverty status. And then most importantly, for rural-urban disparities, the SPM accounts for geographic variation in cost of living. So essentially, if you live in an area where the median rent of your local area is lower than the national average, your poverty threshold is lower, so therefore you don't need as much income to not be considered in poverty. And this last part is particularly important because when we studies that have looked at adult poverty or old age poverty, they have found that once you account for these cost of living differences, rural-urban poverty disparities actually flip, where urban poverty becomes more prevalent than rural poverty. So therefore, when you use this better measure of poverty under the SPM, maybe we won't see as pronounced rural-urban disparities amongst kids. The second reason for optimism is that we know that child poverty nationally has declined in recent years. And this is particularly true in 2021 as part of the expansion of the child tax credits. So in 2017, the first year that we had these expanded child tax credits, the amount of money that was given to families with kids was doubled to up to $2,000 per child. It also importantly lowered the minimum earnings threshold that a family needed to have in order to begin to qualify for these child tax credits. And so you only need about $2,500 of income to start getting these tax credits. And in order to receive the full $2,000 per kid, you only need to earn around $30,000. Both of those are much lower than they were pre-2017. But in 2021, in response to the COVID-19 pandemic, the government really bolstered these or re-expanded these child tax credits. So they started giving up to $3,600 per kid. There was no earnings requirement, so it went to all parents that had filed taxes. And then it also distributed the payments monthly. So instead of being based on your tax refund, you're getting a set amount per month. And so we can really see on the graph on the right is that starting, once we started implementing these sorts of things in 2017, poverty rates declined. And then between 2020 and 2021, when we expanded this larger increase, poverty rates fell to their lowest lowest level we've ever seen. But in 2017, they kind of reverted back to what they were. Sorry, in 2022, they reverted back to what they were in 2017. So poverty rates went back up if you continue this graph on a little bit more, but obviously we're still in this roughly decades-long decline in child poverty rates under the SPM. And this is only under the SPM because the SPM is the one measure that would capture these child tax credits, not the OPM. And we also know that the CTC, these child tax credits, are particularly beneficial to single families. If you read this Parallel paper, it really shows that families that only have one worker or one parent at home, they are much more likely to be benefited from these child tax credits due to the decrease in that earnings threshold. But we haven't actually looked just yet at whether or not these child tax credits are more beneficial to rural families than urban families. But other work on other federal anti-poverty programs have shown that on average, these programs tend to be more beneficial or are more likely to lift rural kids out of poverty. So therefore, we should maybe expect the CTC was also quite beneficial to rural kids in the United States. The third one is a little bit more of a conceptual reason for optimism, and that's using this notion that once a risk of poverty, so essentially some characteristic that in the population puts somebody at a greater risk for poverty compared to others, once that becomes more common in a society, the less likely it will be stigmatized or penalized. So in one way, the more common a poverty risk such as single motherhood becomes more common, the less likely it is to be penalized in society. And this is pretty true in a cross-national perspective. But it's also been shown to be true within certain poverty characteristics across different US states. So for example, once something like single parenthood becomes more common, there might be less social stigma, there might be reduced barriers to work, and so therefore there's more income for these individuals. So if we are seeing this increase in children living with non-marital families, therefore we should also see a lower risk of poverty associated with this with that family structure. So really, the main thing I'm testing in this paper, in this study, is that the relationship between family structures and poverty might not be so dire if the poverty penalties or that elevated risk of poverty for non-marital families has also declined, or is not, so therefore it doesn't matter if we've had this bigger increase in family diversity. So for this study, I'm going to be looking at three questions. The first two are very broad demographic trends. So how have family structures in rural and urban America changed since 2000? And I'm going to be looking at that in 5 family types that I'll show in the next slide. Then I'm going to be looking at trends in overall child poverty between rural and urban areas. For comparisons, I'm going to be showing the OPM and the SPM, the SPM being kind of this preferred measure. And then finally, I'm going to be looking at, okay, based on what we learned from number 1, number 2, if we are seeing this increase or decrease in poverty rates, how does this relate to the poverty penalties or the risks associated? And specifically, are the poverty penalties declining more or less in rural areas versus urban areas? And when I say the poverty penalty, I'm really referring to the increased risk of poverty relative to the reference group, which is two-parent married families. So I'm looking at data since the year 2000 using the current population survey, but I'm mostly going to be referring to things in 2-year groups. And I've been using the terms rural and urban, which are cultural or social definitions that most of the time us rural research ends up using. But technically, when I mean urban, I'm referring to those who live in metropolitan areas, which includes both big cities like principal cities and their suburbs. And then what I meant by rural is pretty much everybody else who lives in a non-metropolitan county, right? So right now we're in a metropolitan area, but if you drive 1 county over, you're in a non-metro area, and so therefore those are rural kids compared to urban kids who might live in Ann Arbor or in Detroit. And so by family structures, I'm gonna look at 5 family structures. The reference group would be 2 married parents, kids who have 2 cohabiting parents. Unfortunately, due to the data limitations, is that the CPS assumes that cohabitating partners are related to the child, so you actually don't know whether or not the parent of the cohabitating parent is actually the biological, or maybe the step or adopted parent. We don't actually know that, so it is a little bit of a limitation. But on the one hand, that doesn't matter as much because the SPM automatically considers that income regardless of the actual relationship between the cohabitating partner and the child. We're looking at formerly married parents, never married parents, and then kinship care, which is referring to kids who live with no parents. And I may have skipped over this a little bit. There's a number of reasons to think that kinship care or kids who don't live with their parents might be increasingly much faster on the rise in rural areas due to the opioid epidemic, due to the unfortunate incarceration, or health challenges, or even the death of a parent in rural area due to the opioid epidemic. Again, I'm going to be looking at the first 2 things using really broad demographic trends. I'm going to be looking at trends in family structures since 2000, then trends in child poverty, and then I will break those down to look at the observable trends in child poverty by family structure. And then I'm going to be using a series of regressions to look at the adjusted rates of poverty, or the adjusted risks of poverty, controlling for a number of factors. And I'm going to be comparing the earliest time period and then the most recent 4 years of the data to understand whether or not the risks have changed in rural and urban areas, and whether or not they've changed more or less in rural and urban areas. Okay, so beginning with the trends in child poverty that we see. So this is 2 married parents, and we see is that coincidentally in the years in 2000, 2001, the exact same percentage of kids in rural and urban areas lived with 2 parents. It was a little bit more than 2/3 of kids. But since then, we've seen that 2 married parents have rapidly declined in rural areas only. There has been about a 6 or 7 point decrease since the year 2000. There was a little bit of a low that happened at the height of the Great Recession, but there was only a limited bounce back. So we see a small decrease in rural, a noticeable decrease in rural kids living with 2 married parents. And in urban, yeah, there were some ups and downs, but if you compare 2022, 2023 to what it was 20 years ago, you really see basically the exact same rate. So there actually hasn't been that much family change, or at least in terms of 2 married parents being the dominant mode. And so this significant retreat from marriage is something that we've only noticed, or we can only observe in rural families. Urban families might be changing in other ways, but at least when you talk about 2 married families, it's been pretty constant in urban areas, but rural families have rapidly changed, and 2 married parents have become much less common. So if the percent of kids living with 2 married parents has decreased over time, where are those kids going, or where are family structures, what family structures are growing? And so this is looking at the other 4 family structures, and what we really see here is that rural kids are rapidly becoming more likely to live in cohabitating families. They're significantly more likely to live in cohabitating families. There's been this kind of catch-up effect amongst never married parents. Formerly married parents, there's not a huge amount going on, but we are seeing a slow and steady increase in rural kids living in kinship care situations. So where are rural kids going to? They're not living with 2 married parents anymore, and they're increasingly living with cohabitating parents, never married parents, and kinship care, with the first and kind of that third one I mentioned being statistically significant differences. Okay, so we are seeing this decrease in rural kids living with non-married parents, but how does that affect their actual overall rates of poverty we're seeing? If you use the OPM, this measure that a lot of folks, including myself, have critiqued, we actually really don't see that big of trends in child poverty, right? It's increased during the Great Recession, and then it's only slowly decreased over time. But under this, rural kids are much more likely to live in poverty. And at the beginning and end of the time periods, there's really been no change in rural child poverty rates. It's been around roughly 1 in 5 kids. This is using the OPM. Using SPM, we see a significant decline in child poverty rates. And this is really, I think this is optimistic news. Maybe sociologists or demographers we should focus on more optimistic or good news. And like, hey, child poverty rates under the SPM have rapidly fallen, and they're actually falling faster in rural areas versus urban areas. And we actually see this expected flip where once you use the SPM, which controls for localized cost of living, we actually see that rural child poverty rates are much lower, or at least significantly lower in rural areas and in urban areas. And we do see this big decline during the height of COVID, when the child tax credits were at their most expensive or their most generous, but we're seeing an increase afterwards. But obviously, we're still seeing this relatively optimistic pattern of child poverty rates. So we're really seeing this pattern of, more non-marital families did not mean doom and gloom for rural America in terms of increasing their child poverty rates. It did not translate into higher SPM poverty rates. But why did that happen? And if we really see here, we mostly see, and this is, I'll only spend a quick second. This is this is the poverty rates by the 5 family types, and we really see here that amongst married parents, poverty rates actually haven't changed that much over the entire time period. They're basically the exact same what they were 20 years ago. But amongst cohabitating parents and never married parents and amongst kinship care, we're seeing big decreases in those child poverty rates. And we see that their 1-year declines or their 2-year declines were the greatest during the height of the pandemic, when those tax credits were at their most expensive. So we really see that poverty rates have fallen for these kids that we maybe theoretically think are most likely to have been benefited by those expanded child tax credits. So now we're going to move on to these adjusted poverty penalties. So this essentially is using regressions and using some margins after the fact to look at what's the adjusted rate of risk of poverty relative to kids who live with 2 married parents, and this is in the first 4 years of the study. And so something we find here is that across at least 2 of the 4 family structures, rural kids were increasingly penalized relative to their urban peers. So if we look here, formerly married parents, once you control for a whole bunch of factors, we assume that rural kids who live with formerly married parents are around 8% more likely to be in poverty compared to their reference group. But amongst urbans, the oranges, it's only around 4.6%. So therefore, you could pitch this, and this is how we pitch in the paper, is that family structures 20 plus years ago were a much bigger divider between haves and have-nots in rural America. Family structure was a much more bigger determinant of whether or not you live in poverty compared to urban America. But if we fast forward to the end here of the study, we actually find that there's been big decreases in these adjusted poverty rates amongst all groups, with when we particularly see big declines in the never married parents' poverty rates. So if you actually use a series of interaction terms to compare the poverty risks in 2023, we actually find there's no significant rural-urban differences. So these poverty penalties that were a big divider between haves and have-nots 20 years ago, in the most recent years of data, really don't play out anymore. Family structures have really equalized across this thing. Something that was once a big form of disadvantage has really equalized. Obviously, yes, kids who grow up with a single parent or a divorced parent are more likely to be in poverty compared to those with two married parents, but the actual differences amongst those differences, or those differences in poverty rates, have declined or are no longer statistically significant. Okay, but why do these poverty rates fall, right? Obviously, I just showed the basic risks of poverty have fallen across the different family types, but why did that happen? So one potential answer is that the average number of workers, or which is one way to think about family work, the average number of workers in these sorts of rural non-marital families must have increased. And if you look at the trends in the average number of workers across these family types, yeah, there's been a little bit of an increase, but it's not really been that big of a story. So this might be, might just be that more and more, rural moms or rural cohabitating couples are working in the past than they did, but it's not a huge change of what they've really been over time. So it's probably not family work. The answer that I maybe buy more into is that these child tax credits were incredibly beneficial to non-marital families overall, and increasingly, were increasingly beneficial to rural kids relative to urban kids. So if we look at these things, we see that beforehand there was a big difference oftentimes between rural and urban, but by the time we get the expanded tax credits, the rural-urban differences in child poverty, in the child tax credit rates have increased. And even though we don't show in the paper, the potential reason why these child tax credits are more effective is because, yes, more kids, historically, rural kids were in poverty. They might live closer to the poverty line. They might only be a few $100s or a few $1,000s below the poverty line. So through the child tax credits, if you give a little bit more money, it's going to lift more kids out of poverty. While urban kids, yeah, their poverty rates might be relatively lower. More urban kids are in deeper poverty. And that's actually something that me and my co-author are working on. That's kind of our next steps. But maybe it's just who I am, and maybe it's my need to kind of show some optimistic advice. I would argue that it doesn't actually matter the reasons why they've fallen, is because we know that this potential change in family structures has not really had this big negative impact on rural America. And maybe if we, in the media or by the government, there's kind of this push like, oh, we need to re-incentivize marriage. Well, re-incentivizing marriage and trying to re-increase poverty rates wouldn't do something. So this is using a demographic standardization, really basic standardization. And if we find that if poverty rates, if the poverty risks had fallen at the like they have, but we kind of manually put rural families back at their family structures and they were in 2000s, the poverty rate would only decrease by a single percentage point. So this push back towards more universal marriage really wouldn't fluctuate our child poverty rates. But on the inverse, if family structures had changed, but the poverty rates or the poverty risks had stayed what they were in 2000s, rural poverty rates would have skyrocketed, and rural areas under the SPM would actually again be higher than what they rural poverty rates of the SPM would be higher than urban SPM poverty rates. So really, we needed this big decline in child poverty rates. We need this big decline in child poverty risks to kind of move the needle on rural child poverty. Sorry, a return to, like I say here, a return to marriage, universal marriage really wouldn't help rural America too much more. Okay, but what about suburban kids, right? I have only been using this kind of binary rural versus urban or metro versus non-metro divisions, right? But we also know that the majority of kids in the United States live in suburban areas. And we know that there's big differences between, central cities or principal cities and suburban areas. So where do rural kids kind of fit into that hierarchy? Right, this kind of binary rural-urban might mute variation that exists in urban areas, right? Historically, we know that marriage rates were much higher in suburbs and relatively low in principal cities. And we know that poverty rates were historically much higher in principal cities, and suburban poverty rates historically have been pretty low. So we're seeing this, pretty big disparity in terms of the relationship between poverty and family structures across rural and urban areas. So where do rural kids fit into that? So I'm gonna be looking at who rural kids are more similar to today by principal cities. And the definition of principal cities is basically like, the biggest places in a metro area or a few other places. Like I'm originally from the Twin Cities in Minnesota. So Minneapolis and St. Paul are principal cities, but the suburbs are the suburbs. So basically any place else that's not those biggest places in the metro area are considered suburban. And just for simplicity, I'm only gonna be focusing on living with married parents. I have the other slides so we can maybe pull up during the Q&A. But as we can see here is that over the study period, rural kids started off pretty much in the middle of the two other groups, right? They had rates of living with married parents much above principal cities, which are kind of this darker orange, and much below suburban children. And over the studies period, there hasn't been this huge variation or a huge change in the marital patterns of suburban families, but we have seen urban or principal city marriage rates increase while rural has fallen. So therefore, in terms of marital patterns, rural kids and rural families are quite similar in terms of family structures to those who live in principal cities. But if you look at the SPM poverty rates overall, we actually see that at the beginning of the time period, yes, rural was kind of in the middle, but we've seen this big rural decrease, and the fact that rural kids' poverty rates today are pretty much identical to those in suburban areas. So we're seeing this kind of, paradox or result that you have to think sometimes a little bit right. They're very similar to traditionally disadvantaged principal city kids in terms of their family structures, but today they're pretty similar in terms of poverty rates to traditionally advantaged suburban kids. So there's definitely this sort of mix-up that's going on. They're similar to urban or principal cities in one regard, but they're pretty similar to suburban in this other regard. Okay, that was a lot of results. So rural children have really experienced three major trends since 2000. So if you want to, tell your roommate or tell your partner, tell your mom what you learned today, these are three things you can tell them, right? So these are the three trends that you can kind of take as major takeaways. So since the year 2000, rural family structures have become much more diverse, and today they're much more diverse than urban families. Today, around 4 in 10 or around 40% of rural kids live with someone other than two married parents. And they're much more likely to live in cohabiting families and in kinship care families than their urban peers are. Rural child poverty rates and also as well as urban poverty rates have fallen sharply, particularly since 2017, particularly since we saw this increase in tax credit, in the increase in the child tax credits. And then finally, the poverty penalties, or that adjusted poverty risk, has seen a big reduction over the past 20 years, right? Family structure used to disproportionately be a big divider between the haves and have-nots in rural America, and today we see there's no differences in the mechanism or the role that family structures can determine in child poverty between rural and urban. So nowadays, family is much more, the role of family structures is really equalized across rural and urban areas. So my one policy angle of this, or at least my primary policy angle is this, that I think these findings should really quell fears that family diversity or a move away from traditional or big two-parent married families will harm rural kids, right? As I showed in those demographic standardizations, a return to universal marriage really won't help rural America. Poverty rates wouldn't fall that much more if we went back to the family structures, they were 20, 25 years ago. It's really been this decline in poverty penalties that has really helped rural kids. But that doesn't necessarily mean that this is still being heard, right? Earlier this year, which feels like maybe multiple years ago at this point, right? The Trump administration put out a memo saying that they are going to start directing the Department of Transportation and a few other federal agencies to try to prioritize funding to areas that had higher birth rates and also higher marriage rates. And there was a lot of talk at this time that's like, oh, this is really gonna benefit rural areas, right? Because rural areas are the ones where we have high fertility rates, which is a little complicated, but another talk. And rural areas are the ones where we have a huge amount of, much higher rates of married families. Well, as we show here, is actually this sort of policy that kind of equates rurality with traditional universal marriage is not the same. If you had this policy, you would actually disproportionately give funding to probably suburban areas or principal city areas. I know I pitched a relatively positive story, and I think that's true, but the child tax credits are changing. As part of the big beautiful bill that got passed earlier this summer, there's going to be a number of key changes to the child tax credits that might make the story that I told in earlier slides a little trickier and a little fuzzier, right? So starting next year, so starting when parents file taxes, both children and parents will need a Social Security number in order to qualify for these benefits. Under the old system, only the child needed to have a Social Security number. So only the child needed to be a citizen or some other form of permanent resident. So this was effectively done to exclude many immigrant populations and undocumented immigrant populations. And I've done other work to really show that the immigrant populations in rural America has really increased or much more catching up to what it is in urban America. So we're gonna categorically prevent children of immigrants from getting the child tax credits they need. And while the minimum earnings threshold, that relatively $3,000 that you needed to start earning a little bit of the tax credits remains relatively low, they actually reduced the amount of child tax credits down to $2,200. And in order to earn that full $2,200, you need to earn around $36,000. But beforehand, you only needed around $30,000. So the bar to get those full tax credits has decreased quite a bit. One last major implication is that, and I think this really shows the position that rural families or rural America really plays in general in US society, is that rural kids have a complex pattern of disadvantage, where they have a very complex or don't have a one-size-fits-all way of thinking about them in the rural-urban continuum, right? Like I showed pretty clearly in the slides, rural family structures are pretty similar to principal city families. They have relatively low rate or relatively lower rates of two married parent families, but their poverty rates are much more similar to the traditionally advantaged suburban areas. And we typically view suburbs as historically being where there's not a lot of, or there's less poor families and poor individuals. So the real main takeaway is that this can continue, this sort of complex position rural kids have, or this complex relationship between family structures and poverty rates, as long as those poverty penalties remain low, so as long as we don't as a society disproportionately penalize one-parent families or cohabiting parent families, or more untraditional family structures, as long as those poverty penalties remain low, family change and kind of this growing family diversity won't lead to doom and gloom or an increase in child poverty rates in rural America or elsewhere. And I'm actually going to steal a phrase from Dave Brady, who's a big poverty scholar. And a lot of this really work shows is we need to stop maybe focusing on fixing we need to start focusing on fixing poverty. So what are some policy implications, tax solutions, various other sorts of programs that can make those that are at risk for being in poverty less likely to be in poverty, and less about fixing poor people, right? Many governmental programs really incentivize marriage. And as I showed with the counterfactuals and a lot of these results, if we did incentivize marriage, it really wouldn't move the needle on poverty too much. So we need to think about programs to lower poverty risk rather than programs that will incentivize marriage. All right, I'm ready for questions. Thanks, everybody.
Wait for questions. Let's start. Yep.
Thanks for the talk. I was kind of curious about the role of race. You're comparing, kind of curious how racially diverse the rural population is. You know, Christina Cross, Regina Baker, and Patricia Williams have all done work showing that single parenthood is a bigger penalty for families, for white children. That finding that becomes penalizing.
Great. So I've done some work on this stuff. So rural America is rapidly diversifying or rapidly seeing bigger Hispanic and Asian populations and multiracial populations. It's not as diverse as the rest of the United States or urban America, but it's definitely catching up in some regards. And I have done some work that shows that, like, if you break this down by region, you do start to see increasingly different stories. So this is definitely the story that's being pushed by, or this change in marriage rates is definitely being pushed by rural white kids and also rural kids in like the Northeast and the Midwest. The South is obviously this sort of different example. And on the one hand, we do find that if you look at marriage rates amongst Black kids in the South, it's incredibly low, and it's always been incredibly low. It's like, I'm not exaggerating, it's like close to only like 15 or 16% of rural kids, Black kids in the South of the two married parents. But we also know that rural America is also very racially unequal. And so the story that kind of pushes this sort of positive source picture might leave out a lot of rural kids who are disadvantaged in other ways besides their family structure. So you're 100% right that this is not a story that, this could be a completely different story for Black kids or Hispanic kids who grow up in.
Hey, thanks for the talk. This is really interesting. So I'm curious whether you've looked, when you're showing the trend in the declining penalties for rural versus urban for based on your family structure. I'm curious if you just looked at, like, instead of 2020 to 2023, 2022 to 2023, because obviously it seems like there's a very big spike in declines in poverty just mechanically as a result of the expanded child tax credit.
Right.
And it seems like if this is driving, I mean, it seems plausible to me that this could drive a lot of the compression between urban and rural areas. And so maybe the story is not so rosy if we're looking at, like, what's actually going on now.
Yeah, so yes, you're right. And the reason why we did the 2-year period versus the 1-year period is, like, earlier in the study period, you get like a lot more fuzzy change. So we had to settle on the 2-year period. But we did try different cutoffs points. And basically, if you did end the study in 2020, 2021, and started looking at those year change, you basically get the same sorts of patterns where you have seen this big decline in rural urban poverty. And rural poverty remaining lower under the SPI. The other sort of thing is that when we're looking, the reason why we looked in the regressions of looking at the 4-year period of change is because those 4 years contain both the child tax credits at their highest and also the child tax credits at a more moderate sort of level. And when you do, obviously, the poverty penalties, if you just looked at the 2021 period, the poverty penalties decreased the most. But even if we had, a world where we both have these super expanded child tax credits and what they've been since 2017, we still see this big decline in rural poverty rates and these rural child poverty penalties, regardless of kind of the years you flex around with it. But obviously, yeah, if you change the year, the end result, you will get a slightly different magnitude of change.
So I'm perplexed by the child tax credit. So
yeah,
I studied the child tax credit. That with me for a second. I don't think of it in the current form as an anti-poverty policy. I would just say it is typically for a middle-class family.
right.
I know we expanded it in 2017. It became more generous, but the earnings threshold only declined by $500. So that's not gonna be the explanation. The part that I'm perplexed about is there's a phase-in. And as you discussed, you basically have to earn at least $30,000 to get the full credit. The poverty threshold is lower than $30,000.
For most families.
But it's not $30,000 universally, because it adjusts by, doesn't it adjust by family size?
It adjusts by family size, but it's not, I looked this up earlier this week for another wrong. I'm pretty sure that one parent, 2 kids is, it's still pretty close to $30,000, or it might be a little bit lower than 30,000. Somebody can check.
I can tell you what a 1 kid,
Yeah.
1 parent is, it's like around 10. So there, I could think you can buy, you're into at least the fully refundable part of the credit.
Mm.
It's like 15 to 20. You're
Yeah.
still the income for a 1-parent household or even a 2-parent household for the poverty threshold is lower than that. So there's something about this where I'm like, how is it that we're pushing people above the poverty threshold by the child tax credit? Do you see what I'm saying?
Yeah, and it's definitely a tricky thing, but I think that kind of for your first point, it's like, yeah, this kind of goes to show that like the child tax credits were not created as this big anti-poverty program. But the results and like a lot of the work that Zach Carolyn has done, it really showed like, no, this program ended up being really beneficial to low-income families from many different backgrounds. So it kind of shows that even if the point of the program wasn't anti-poverty, it ended up being poverty.
You mean even outside of 2021?
Yeah, I'm rather confident. But I think the main sort of thing is you're right in terms of it really does have to do that degree. Like you started like with $2,500 and then you get the max benefits at $30,000. I think the specific points where the average rural family, these different family types is versus urban families might vary. So you might have a more rural families that are at the higher end, the lower end of the curve. So therefore, when you give them just a few thousand extra dollars, you end up really benefiting them. Well, urban families tend to be much deeper sorts of poverty. And there's also other sorts of ways that the work, and I'm parodying Carolyn, is there's other sorts of ways that Black and Latino and other sorts of family types has disproportionately, they get less money in those child tax credits, even above their income. And so there's definitely some other forms of systematic expansion. I don't have a great answer for you, but it's like,
No, it's not that I don't believe you,
Yeah.
it's that I'm surprised that you have, I'm still surprised that there's such a decline, given sort of where the thresholds are. Now I need to go revisit.
Thanks for this. I have a question about the penalties, the like adjusted penalties.
Right.
Something I really like the Brady et al. Paper, and I like what you're doing. Something I've never understood in that paper is the controlling for number of employed family members and controlling for female headship, because it seems like those are two of the ways that we think marriage and cohabitation really benefit people.
right. So I think the defense of this would be that, so the Brady framework is very big on, we should only think about modifiable factors as like a way to change poverty rates. So things like parents' income or parents' age or family structure. And so the reason why we control and the reason why we end up sticking with, when we were first working this paper, we had a lot of different things like, oh, should we control for family work or should we not control for family work? Is that, yes, by definition, a 2-parent family probably has twice as many adults in the household as one where there's only a single mom or a single dad. Therefore, it's obvious that there should be this increased work. So really showing here that beyond work, and we know that the relationship between gender work and family is more complex than that, but we really show that like, okay, even beyond this sort of, mechanical increase in the number of workers in the household, we're seeing this decline in the social risks of poverty.
Yeah, I guess I don't like buy it. I feel like the penalty associated with the different family structures should be like the average effect of changing family structure on a family's characteristics.
So you mean like a longitudinal type thing?
I mean, just like a total causal effect rather
Okay.
than the residual effect net of important ways that it shapes the resources of the household.
Sure. Which really means we got the same exact results if you don't control for the average number of workers in the household.
And for female headship?
And for, well, I mean, like, we're not controlling for, are we controlling?
You are.
Okay.
Your notes say you are, yeah.
Then we probably are. But I just like wasn't sure because like, oh yeah. I guess the female headship, that's probably one of the more easy controls you can do, because if you have multiple adults in the household, how headship is determined is like 100% random. But it's at least showing that, like, I think the reason why we go is like, okay, well, you include female headship because is this a family structure poverty type story, or is this like a feminization of poverty type story? Are we really just talking about the declining family like poverty rates associated with women in general? And I think controlling for family structures, and I think that's also the thing that that Brady would recommend. Like you control for female headship because you want to try to isolate family structures relative to other sorts of gender factors that might influence poverty rates.
Thank you. This is super interesting, and I always love when talks conclude with clear policy implications. Very nicely done. I am curious. I assume kinship care does not include in foster care, and so I don't know if you know anything about how has that the proportion of kids in foster care in urban versus rural areas changed over time, and how that might play into.
I don't know about the relationship between foster. I can't give you a great answer about whether or not rural and urban kids are more likely to be in foster care. I can imagine the scenario where rural kids are more likely to be placed in foster situations, but there's also probably less foster parents. There might be like we're going to send you to a different county or a few towns over, things like that. But in general, the OPM specifically excludes kids, and I guess this is the minor technical one I didn't highlight in the talk, is that the OPM excludes kids in foster care. It just does not calculate poverty risks for them. And the SPM does, which you end up adding like a percent of kids back in. So we did remove the foster kids from this sort of thing, because otherwise there's a different dimension that the OPM has. And the reason why the SPM includes foster kids is technically the on-paper reason is that it's just assuming that money from unrelated adults also affects children, while under the OPM it's assuming like no, there's only a relation. There's only this sort of spending money for kids or income available for kids if there's like a blood or adoption sort of relationship.
So the kinship care definition then, is there some accounting that like they're with an adult that they're biologically related to, or it's
So
just?
So about 90% of the kids who are in kinship care category are being raised by their grandparents. And the next largest group is some other adults, so maybe like an aunt and uncle or something like that. And only a very small percentage of those kids are not in foster care and are living with like an adult they're not living with. So you can imagine like a very specific scenario where like you're living with like some your aunt and uncle, but they're not actually your like aunt and uncle or something like that. Yeah.
I have a question, Matt. I'm sorry. Go ahead, Isabel.
Do you have a sense of how meaningful SNAP is in the second definition of poverty? I'm curious what you think about like SNAP runs out.
Yeah.
Or what's going to happen.
So a lot of the big work that's showing the advantages of SPM versus the OPM has really shown that SNAP is a big thing, because the SPM counts half-like transfers, which it counts SNAP. And so I don't necessarily, so obviously the reason why poverty rates have declined more is overall under the SPM or the OPM, they're a little bit more sticky, sans some like, some temporal differences, is because of the SNAP. But there has been other work that's shown that SNAP specifically is more beneficial to rural families in terms of their poverty rates than urban families. And that has to do with the like where you are relative to the poverty threshold, which is kind of like in those papers, that's kind of what I'm using this to help back up my hypothesis that the CETC is so beneficial to rural kids, is because we know SNAP and TANF and one other federal poverty program are more beneficial to rural kids than urban kids.
So tell me about whether you think these results are, okay, what does it mean to be in poverty in a rural area versus to be in poverty in an urban area? And what does this mean for kids' sort of opportunity? I'm asking you to like really pull back for a minute.
Sure.
And think about the sort of institutional and sort of structural resources that are available to kids growing up in poverty in these two places, and then thinking about the likelihood that kids are going to stay in rural areas versus migrate to more urban areas when they reach adulthood or seeking further education and so forth. Like, is this a story where really we're seeing equalization of kids in the suburbs and kids in rural areas in terms of their opportunity structures? Or how are you thinking about, kind of what are the consequences of this leveling? Do kids in public schools in rural areas get the same set of resources to take with them later as kids in some of these other environments, et cetera? I'm just curious what you think about the sort of big implications of this are for rural, urban, suburban inequality, more broadly speaking.
Okay, so I think there's two questions. I want to answer the first one first. Is like, what does it mean to be poor in rural and urban areas? I bet if you asked, and this is just a hunch, but I think the qualitative research would also suggest it's like, if you took somebody who was in poverty in rural areas, there's a probably less likely chance that they would view themselves as being like a poor, disadvantaged individual. And it's all because of like who you're relatively comparing it to. Because you oftentimes know that poverty tends to be more concentrated in rural areas. So areas that have a rural poverty tend to be like those local areas tend to be really high poverty. So there's a little bit more in terms of that. I don't have a great answer until how this might impact us in the future, but there is a lot of show that the kids work by Dylan Connors has really shown that rural kids who grow up in two married parent households, and this is a cohort of kids who grew up in who were 10 to 15 years old in like the 80s or 90s, those kids experience huge upward mobility. That's one of the most upward mobile groups of kids we've seen is rural kids who grew up with two married parent families. So obviously, yes, that would complement the story in the past, where yes, in the past, marriage or family structure was this big divider between haves and have-nots. It's obviously rural kids who grew up with two married parents would experience this huge upward mobility. Now, there might be, you could argue maybe less upward mobility for those rural kids today who live with two married parents, or the more positive or the more optimistic way is like the upward mobility for rural kids who grew up in other family structures might have caught up to the geographic, the social mobility of rural kids. That's mostly because, and the Connors work also really shows like a big reason why rural married kids have this big upper mobility is because they move and they migrate to a different rural area and they have this ability to leave their community, which might be relatively disadvantaged to begin with. But they grow up as like, one way to put it is like they might have grown up as like, biggest fish in like a little pond, and so therefore when they leave and they can go off to college, and then after college they have relatively great upward mobility because they were able to leave a relatively affluent area, a relatively impoverished area, and move to a much more affluent or suburban area, which might be a little bit more middle class or upper class.
Yeah, it makes me curious about changes in the labor market and particularly with changes in rural college going, if that like story that we saw for the kids of the 80s and 90s is sort of still true.
That's a great question. On the one hand, I believe rural kids have always been, and they continue to be less likely to go off to college than their urban peers. But I don't actually know, my gut feeling is that it's you're not seeing like this big withdrawal from rural kids going off to college. It's not like rural kids and they're aware of their changing labor market circumstances, so they're like, oh, college is not worth it. But this big increase that we've seen in urban areas might be a tiny bit slower in rural areas. And I think higher education, obviously, right, this is looking at kids, so I don't know anything about their well-being as young adults, or I don't know any sort of things about their social mobility or economic mobility later on in life. But in general, the research has shown that like rural kids who go off to college, rural kids who grow up in married parent households, at least historically, had pretty really good upward mobility later on in life.
My last call. Thank you so much, Matt, for your talk, for the lively conversation, for the policy implications that are very vivid right now as the government stays in shutdown and these interventions are grinding to a halt. Thanks everybody for coming. Have a great week. Enjoy Halloween. See you next time.